their items aren't that big.
So, we have to finish up a couple topics today, and then tomorrow you guys are going to get started on your projects. I am going to go over that right after we're done talking today. So stay focused for that bit at the end, because you are probably going to like what you hear. Maybe, I don't know, maybe not. I don't know. When we last met Thursday, we went over French Gothic architecture, which took forever. But we looked at a lot of different cathedrals too, and a lot of the different architectural elements that make them up. Does anyone remember like some of the key characteristics of French Gothic architecture?
It's like that illusion.
Linear, vertical, tall, yes. That is the main thing, and I'm saying that, and I wanted to point that out again because English Gothic is where we're picking up today, and it is not vertical. It is all about horizontal. So you're still using the Gothic architectural elements, but differently. So English Gothic is its own thing, which is why it has its own little category, even though England and France are quite close together. But it happens because around 1269, there's a Parisian architect working in the French Gothic style that redesigns a church in Germany. And then they do the same thing in Spain around 1254. And well, Gothic architecture ends up becoming quite popular all over Europe, but everyone has their own way of doing it. We talked about French, it's all about verticality. English is flatter. So England chose to do their own thing and marry Romanesque style, which if you remember was all about basilicas and cross shapes, and put that together with the Gothic architectural elements. And yeah, this is mostly because that's what the locals wanted. It's what they needed. It's what they wanted in life. It's not lesser than, in fact, well, you'll see. You will see. Remember at the end, I said when we were done with this, I'm gonna ask you guys if you like French Gothic, English Gothic, or Holy Roman Empire Gothic the most. Keep that in mind. I have a preference. I'm not gonna tell you. Now, our first English Gothic cathedral is Salisbury Cathedral. It does still have its very vertical tower in the center. However, if you remember our French Gothic churches, the entire thing was tall, not just one tower. This still very much sticks to its horizontal basilica format that was popular with the Romanesque style. It has your nave, your aisles, it has two transepts. They did incorporate side chapels to house relics just like the other Gothic churches. And of course, you can kind of pick out some of the Gothic architectural elements, specifically with that tower. It is very pointed, as well as the other spires. They too are pointed. We also have a few flying buttresses, which are Gothic as well. So we have some merging of French Gothic motifs with Roman architectural choices. And you'll notice the date, it spans a long period of time there. Pretty typical for all the churches that we've talked about though. Salisbury Cathedral is the like quintessential English Gothic church. We are going to look at the interior of it, and we're going to look at the interior of a few other English Gothic churches as well. Just because there's some different decor items that were chosen for them than that are different from France. So here is the facade of Salisbury Cathedral. Like I mentioned, they did use flying buttresses. However, it was quite a bit more sparing than French Gothic that had them everywhere. But French Gothic, of course, was a lot taller, so they needed that support more. And as I mentioned, there is a double transept. They do have lancet windows instead of a rose window on the end. There are portions of Salisbury though that do have a rose window, and we'll look at that later. But as you can see, there's more emphasis placed on that cross formation than there is height, which is typical of English Gothic style. Salisbury Cathedral and the other churches that we're talking about, except for Westminster, they are still being used as, well, churches today, just like our French counterparts that we talked about on Thursday. So keep that in mind. Here is the interior. You do see rib vaulting, just like the other Gothic churches that we talked about last week, as well as your Gothic pointed arch. Compound piers, which are made up of multiple columns. The other churches from the French Gothic era that we talked about last week had those as well. And something that they did differently is juxtapositioning the white stone with black marble, creating a really interesting decorative motif. So that's what I meant, like they do something a little bit different. Generally, with all of the English columns, they will do their own thing. We're going to look at another example of columns inside of Durham in a second that differs from French style. French was very white. The white emphasizes height. In England, they aren't interested in that. But I kind of like the black and white. Now, a different cathedral. This one we're only looking at the interior. The exterior is, well, Romanesque, more Romanesque than Gothic. Gloucester Cathedral in England. This is the choir. The choir on top, it does have a barrel vault to it. However, it doesn't look like a barrel vault. It looks like a whole bunch of roof vaults all put together to create that kind of spider webbed effect. However, it is just your traditional barrel vault, which they've of course added a lot of motifs. It also has the stained glass windows, which take up almost the entirety of the wall, that are done in 3 tiers. You kind of saw it inside of this one as well. The front of the choir just has those transept windows instead of like a rose circular window and transepts. They're doing more of just like a transept style. I love this one though. You have your large Gothic pointed arch and then 3 smaller Gothic pointed arches within it, and then even smaller ones inside that. So a really repetitive pattern within a pattern. And of course, the one that I have been to, Chapel of Henry the, I can't count today, 7th. So this is located inside of Westminster Abbey. I will say that when you're walking into this chapel, the ceiling is not what you notice. I don't know if anyone else has been there besides me, but I did not notice the ceiling. I was paying attention to the flags because I was looking for my family crest, so I was a little distracted. I did find it. But so they have every single major family from, well, England, and their family crest represented along seats. The seats would have once been filled with the old Parliament. Of course, now there's a new Parliament building for special events like a wedding ceremony. And they have the ceiling up here. The ceiling is pretty interesting though. I wish that I'd paid more attention to it. I remember it being really sooty though when I went. So possibly why I didn't really pay attention to it. I think I noticed it, but I didn't care. Wish I noticed it a little bit more then. It does have ribbed vaulting and webbing, but it's a very different take on ribbed vaulting. It creates kind of like a pendant or stalactite formation coming down from the ceiling, reminiscent of some of the Islamic styles that we looked at from Spain earlier. So it is a bit Gothic-ish, a bit like the flamboyant style. So you see the flame-like protrusions coming off of the arches, but a very different take on it. Very unique take on it. That does take us into the Holy Roman Empire. Last we talked about them, they already had a bunch of churches. They did. They were all Romanesque style. So we won't see too many more churches since they already had a bunch. They mostly focused on the luxury arts. So your reliquaries, your metal objects, and your illuminated manuscripts. Yep, we're back to that. They did have some Gothic churches, though. Of course, they didn't tend to stick towards the Romanesque style of things, even more so than the English ones did. But we will look at one. Now, the leading artist of this region during the 12th and 13th century is Nicholas of Verdun. We are going to look at some of his reliquary items. If you look in your book, there's another object that I left out that he made as well. I think it's a pulpit, but I don't remember. I'm pretty sure it's a pulpit. But yeah, I'm focusing on the reliquary because it's a little bit cooler. Reliquaries, once again, are meant for housing relics. This particular reliquary housed items relating to the three magi. And covering the entire, what looks like a sarcophagus, because it is 6 feet by 6 feet. It's huge. Covering it is repoussé, gold that has been beaten from behind, decorated with the Magi themselves and scenes of Mary and the Magi interacting, as well as scenes of Old Testament prophets and New Testament prophets, or apostles, depending on which way you want to phrase that. This kind of gives you an idea that yes, they're still working with the Romanesque style. The inside of these very plain looking exteriors is a lot of really opulent materials being showcased, such as this object. This is located inside of Cologne Cathedral. I saw this. You remember that cross that I mentioned last week that I didn't pay attention to? Yeah, this I did. Because it is huge and it's really hard to miss. This is shiny. So like I said, it is gilded in gold, done with repoussé, beaten from behind to get all of these images of these saints and apostles. It is 6 feet by 6 feet, so yeah, it's really hard to ignore. So obviously we have our orbs with our crosses on top, which are symbols that have been around since Constantine. They were very popular during Charlemagne's reign again. Charlemagne, of course, the Holy Roman Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. This is long after him though, and they are still sticking to those motifs. We still have our Roman arch and our Roman columns, not the Gothic arch. So sticking to their roots, which is what the Holy Roman Empire will do for a long time, which eventually comes to be known as Germany. Another example of artwork from a Holy Roman Empire. This kind of does showcase the merging of Gothic traditions. Last week we did talk about some French Gothic sculptures outside of cathedrals, and most of you noticed that they did appear to be a little bit more natural and less stiff than early Christian art. That is also picked up in the Holy Roman Empire. We also looked at a sculpture last week with a canopy over top. That canopy is, well, synonymous with French Gothic style. This canopy, of course, is a little bit more toned down than the high French Gothic canopy that we looked at last time. But it does incorporate your Gothic arches. The canopy itself is, well, a church. And of course, the figures, that's Eckhard and Uta. On Naumburg Cathedral, the master who made these sculptures dedicated them to the images of the first donors to the church, so the people that paid for the church to be built. By the time he actually sculpted Eckhard and Uta, they had been long dead. So he's doing this just from description. But your book points out, and I definitely agree, it looks like they stood for him to model. So really hitting home that idea that this is a transition period into the Renaissance. We are getting very natural during this stage. Is it extraordinarily natural? No, they are still adhered to the stone behind them. That will shift, but they do look a lot more realistic. And the fact that the paint's still on them helps. Mm-hmm. And that does take us to Cologne Cathedral. I'm pretty sure this is the last of the churches. Cologne Cathedral is the one that I did go to. It is very, very French Gothic style. Very much. It's constantly being repaired and restored. It's always breaking. It did survive World War II. There were a lot of aerial bombings in Cologne during World War II. All of the stained glass windows were blown out during the war, but the structure itself stood up, which just is a testament to the strength of Gothic architecture. It can stand up to bombings without falling apart. It, of course, incorporates a lot of the Gothic pointed arches. It is done in the flamboyant style with the flame-like protrusions on it. And it does incorporate a large amount of roof vaulting and flying buttresses, which is kind of what stabilized it throughout all of those attacks. And it is huge and it's really impressive. Really, really, really impressive. Like I said, I went there during Christmas time and there's a huge Christmas tree that they put out front. This is the back side of the cathedral, by the way, the front's over here. And then they have a Christmas mark in front of it. It's really pretty. It's gorgeous to see. Yeah. And here is the front. My hotel was right across the way here. I got to wake up looking at this every day. It was nice. But you can see they're always restoring it. There's scaffolding there. It's just falling apart, which is a shame. It was not originally this sooty and black. That's just pollution. Sorry. But you can see it has your traditional Gothic style doors and porches, the flamboyant style tracery above the porch, as well as all the tracery around the windows. And here is your nave and aisles, all of which have ribbed vaulting and pointed Gothic arches. So this church is really done in like the high Gothic, French Gothic style, I should say. Now, the thing that I actually want there to see is the new stained glass windows, which are not in your book, but I decided to include. These are by the artist Gerhard Richter, contemporary artist. So instead of scenes of like biblical figures, Gerhard Richter is known for his plays on colors and pixels. He's been known to paint extraordinarily realistic paintings of people. If you ever are curious, you can look up Betty by Gerhard Richter. It looks like photograph, but that is because he cared so much about the pixelation of it when he was painting. Same with this, pixels. It literally looks like pixels, which is his style. And he redid all the windows in the cathedral. So what I went to see, because I was studying contemporary art, not Gothic. But yeah, it's pretty cool. Our second church, I guess there was one more, St. Elizabeth Marburg. Oh yeah, this one kind of shows you the more traditional style of Gothic in the Holy Roman Empire, because Cologne Cathedral is not really standard for them. bit of an offshoot. Most standard Gothic style in the Holy Roman Empire is also very squat and flat, even more squat than the English style was. Very much sticking to the Romanesque roots. This church does have a nave. It does not have aisles. Well, I mean, it does, but there's no arches disconnecting them. It's all one building. Kind of reminds me of a church today. Like if I go into my old Baptist church that I grew up in, everything's all connected. It's not separated. There is no trivium, triforium, or clerestory, so it's all one level. You don't have multiple levels like our usual Gothic churches. They do use rib vaulting, but they don't use it to create more levels. They're just using it because it's a Gothic motif. And of course, another Gothic motif that it uses is pointed arches and lancet windows. Because this church is so short, there's no need for flying buttresses. It doesn't need that exterior support. So I feel like this style ends up becoming the more traditional Christian church style myself, just because that's what I grew up with. This is quite ostentatious. Mm-hmm. It's gorgeous, but it's ostentatious. In summary, for Gothic art, birthplace, France. How do English and Holy Roman Empire style differ from France? One of them is tall, and the others are more long. Sticking to more Romanesque style. Good. Did you guys like all the vocabulary? Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of sad that it's like common vernacular in my brain now. And of course, the big question, which was your favorite and why? I'll give you guys about like 30 seconds to make a decision. Maybe a minute, I don't know. Before we get into this. So a minute to pick out if you like the French, the English, or the Holy Roman Empire style the most. And why? Grace, do you have one?
Yeah, I think I have a preference towards the French Gothic. Like I like the style better, and I like the stained glass.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know if it's my favorite or not. My opinion can be easily swayed. Anyone in class have a preference?
Holy Roman Empire.
Why?
I like the darkness.
You like the pollution.
Yeah.
It does give it an aged effect that's pretty cool.
Yeah. I just like kind of like the medieval.
Yeah,
really
it gets
medieval.
that dark ages kind of feel. I get it. Yeah.
That's all.
I get it.
I have to agree with Grace. I'm more of a fan of the French because I also I feel like those are the kind of cathedrals or buildings that you step into.
Yeah.
It doesn't even feel like you're in
Yeah.
current reality anymore.
Yeah. Anyone else have a preference? French? Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah. You want to share? I'm not going to make you. Okay. I'm not going to make you. And I don't know. I think it's just because I toured so many. I like English style. But yeah, I visited every single major cathedral in London and some of the other towns while I was there. So it's just my preference. Some of the later cathedrals in London, they incorporate more of a Spanish style as well, which I appreciate. If you remember back to the Alhambra, they'll incorporate some of that. And there's others, like the one that's right next door to the National Gallery, that is very Baroque in style. Baroque period is known for drama and theater. So the whole church is set up like a dramatic theater performance, which is kind of cool. But it still keeps to those Gothic roots while incorporating other styles, which is cool to me. I like Holy Roman Empire probably second best. I like those two in particular just because they do incorporate different cultures and different periods into the new style. And I think that's a little bit interesting. But you know, that's my preference, I guess, since I promised I would tell you my preference. That does take us into what's happening in Italy at the same time. Italy's doing their own thing. Not really. In Italy, they're experiencing what most art historians consider an early Renaissance period. It really depends on who you ask. Some art historians will say it's the late medieval period of Italy. Some art historians say early Renaissance. I more border along early Renaissance just because it's during this time period that Giotto pops up. Giotto is considered the artist that sparks the Renaissance in Italy. So we will be talking a lot about Giotto. There's a heads up. The other thing that you're going to notice more as we go through Italy is there's like only 2 architectural bits that we're going to be talking about. The rest are all individual painters. We see a lot of painters and a lot of names of people and a lot of families. You'll also notice more naturalism, which you already kind of saw happening in France and Germany and, well, England too. We just didn't look at any of those sculptures. But it's definitely more prominent in Italy as they are, well, looking at the classical sculptures that they have as reference for new sculptures. We will still see late antiquity and Byzantine art referenced in this new style as they try and figure out how to balance it and merge it with the classical style. Classical style, of course, being Greek and Roman. We are starting off with the 13th century, and then we'll go into the 14th century. I did just like, I know Brandon's using his book. Brandon's going to probably see a lot more stuff. I just chose some of the like masterpieces from that era to focus on rather than going over everything. So if you are interested, there's more examples of work by these artists in your book than what we're going over. I just chose their quintessential pieces to look at. So in the 13th century, we see the beginnings of the revival of classical art in Italy, and it'll be even more prominent when we get to the 14th century. In painting in particular, like I said, you're going to see a merge with Byzantine and classical styles happening. The first thing we're going to look at is a pulpit by an artist whose name you'll find in a second. But then in a second, we're going to compare his sculpture relief on that pulpit to his son's. They are similar, but very different. His son is working in the Byzantine style. He's working in the classical style. And that artist is Nicola Pisano. We're going to see a lot of Pisanos today. Some of them are related, like this one, father and son. The other one is not. So how last names work in this time period is you usually will take on a name of a town that you identify with, like Pisa, Pisano. It's not really a family name. So like Da Vinci is from the town Vinci. Yeah, that's how it works. So just a little preface there. We're going to see 3 Pisanos. 2 of them are related. The other one's not. It's just he's from Pisa too. Giotto di Bondone is from a town called Bondone. Keep that in mind going forward. There's a few other cultural things that'll be putting in here and there just to give you kind of a grasp on why they do things they do. And that was just the first one to start off. So around this time period, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II came to power in Germany, and well, Pisano actually like studied from the masters that worked for Frederick II. So because Frederick II loved the classical style so much, he in turn influenced the art to change back to the classical style, influencing people that were going to school at that point. Well, I say school, but working as an apprentice at that time under masters and changing the way they do their art. So that's one of the reasons why Pisano's sculptural reliefs on this pulpit look to be a little bit more classical. He actually copied the actual figures off of Roman sarcophagi. Sorry, I got a text message at the same time. I was a little distracted. I'm a realtor. I was like, but we actually know that he copied for a fact these figures because we found those sarcophagi located in Pisa that he used as reference. He did carve this entire pulpit. For a pulpit at this time, the guy preaching would walk up a set of stairs to the top of this and preach out of it. Of course, it has your trefoil arches, which were Gothic style at the time, combined with Corinthian double Corinthian. It has 2 layers of acanthus leaves, columns without fluting. So it's kind of Greek, not really, kind of Gothic, not really, a merging of styles. You can already see it here. And the entire piece is marble. It is 15 feet high. I wouldn't want to preach up there, but maybe it would be cool, like very commanding. Here is a close-up of the sculptural relief that we're going to be comparing to his sons, though. This is Pisano, well, I shouldn't say Pisano because the other one's Pisano too, Nicola Pisano's Annunciation, Nativity, and Adoration of the Shepherds. As you can see, there's a lot going on. We have 3 different stories being told at once on one panel. In the center, you see Mary reclining. She's reclining in a very similar pose to the Etruscan sarcophagi that we talked about a long time ago. He was looking at those as references. And of course, Mary, you see once again over here in a smaller format with the angel Gabriel announcing to her, hey, you're pregnant. And of course, other images as well, like the nativity down here, Christ is, well, being baptized, and other things. So there's multiple stories happening in one spot. It is very densely packed. It's a little confusing. It's a lot confusing, honestly. But his is very much in the classical style. These figures do have volume and mass, and they look very natural. They look like they have human anatomically correct bodies. Now, his son's version. So son, this is the same exact subject matter, the Annunciation, Nativity, and Adoration of the Shepherds, a different pulpit, different version. Once again, Giovanni Pisano is Nicola Pisano's son. It's still a very densely packed relief, but they are a little bit more dynamically arranged. We still see Mary. She's not so much reclining as she is hunched over, holding on to the baby as she just gave birth to him. Down here, he's being baptized. Once again, same exact spot. Over here is the Annunciation, same exact spot. There are a lot more animals, yes. This is done more in the French Gothic style and Byzantine style. You notice the figures are very S-shaped. They are not fully in the round. They look very stiff, not natural or realistic at all. So he used his father's classical style as a reference for this, obviously, but definitely switched up the styling of it. Funny enough, I'll start off with this one. I prefer this version better I find it a little bit easier to read. Even though, like Brandon mentioned, there's more figures in this one than this one, but for some reason I find this one very hard to distinguish subjects. I think it's because of all the shadows, because he tried to create like in the round figures with mass, versus this one's a little bit flatter. I'm seeing a lot of head nodding, which means you are the same, which makes me feel better. Because your book speaks very highly of this one, and I do appreciate classical style. I do. But I find this one a lot simpler to understand.
It's a lot more pleasing.
Yeah. Even though I normally don't like Byzantine style art, but I appreciate this one. And another 13th century artist, Cimabue. I love Cimabue. Doesn't get as much recognition as he should. He is pretty much the predecessor of Giotto and the person that Giotto uses as a reference. And like I mentioned at the beginning, Giotto is kind of the artist that marks the beginning of the Renaissance. But Cimabue is equally important in my eyes, since Giotto used him as a reference. I don't know. This is Madonna enthroned with angels. We're going to see Giotto's Madonna enthroned with angels next. So two of them, same subject, almost same arrangement. One of them is from the 13th century, the other one's the 14th century, quite a bit later. This is a lovely composition that heavily relies on Byzantine style. You can already tell from the gold background, if you remember our Byzantine gold mosaic, it's referencing that. Of course, this is gold leaf instead of tile. And then we have Cimabue trying his best to create the illusion of depth by stacking and using this architectural element here. So he has tried to use linear perspective. He's almost got it correct. It's just a little bit off, to try and make it appear like there's space beyond this. Now, I do believe, this is just my opinion, if there was not a gold background and if there was like a landscape or something behind it, it would look more realistic. But gold was the popular trend for 13th and 14th century art, as they still rely on Byzantine style and feel gold is a very opulent material to show off wealth and importance, and this is, well, an object that was meant for a cathedral. Therefore, it is extremely important and should be ostentatious. I mean, we just looked at that relic from Cologne that was gold. They liked to decorate with gold in the inside of these cathedrals. Any other comments about this one? The excessive fabric folds, yes, that will get better. So even on this fabric fold here, all of these highlights are gold. That was pretty popular in the 13th century to use gold leaf to highlight fabric choices. That'll go away with Giotto. That's kind of a good point to note. Any other comments or thoughts? No?
I like those.
I do too, but we haven't gotten there yet.
I know.
That does take us into the 14th century with Italian art, the age of Giotto, Duccio, and the Lorenzetti brothers, who are the other artists that we're going to be talking about in this section today. There's other artists that were mentioned in your book, but I don't like them, so we're not going to talk about them because I have the power to do that. Yay. So Italy in the 14th century, well, 13th century too, it was comprised of city-states. Every single one of these city-states had their own government. The most prominent government that existed was a republic, but not all of them had republics. So just keep that in mind going forward as to what was happening in this time. Most of the artwork was paid for by wealthy merchants around this area for cleansing of sins. We'll be talking about that. No, we won't. Yeah, we will. We're going to talk about that. Yeah, we are. I'm getting classes mixed up, sorry. My other class is like in the Renaissance era. Now I'm confused. But we are talking about why they paid for all the art today. And it had to do with sin. We can talk about that with the Arena Chapel. Another thing that was happening during the 14th century was the bubonic plague. Took a lot of people. And most of these city-states that were like Florence and Venice, they're tightly packed and they rely on trade. And it is through trade that the bubonic plague spread from China to the rest of the world. So places like Venice are going to be hit really hard. And that'll pop up later on. So. And of course, we have literature being spread as the printing press was invented around this time period, creating a slightly more literate population, but we're still dealing with artworks that are trying to create narrative illustrations for those people that can't read yet. And it's going to take a long time before everyone's allowed to read. And humanism is born. Humanism is a way of thinking which encourages people to think for themselves. Which sounds crazy, but yeah. It ends up leading to the creation of multiple new religions, as does the printing press. It also supports the idea of really trying to support your government and your church in different ways than just donating money, like actually becoming an advocate and changing things. Yeah. So it's a different thought process, which doesn't sound crazy to us today because we do that. But back then it was pretty groundbreaking. And there's a lot more to humanism as well. The founder of humanist thinking, his name was Erasmus. And it all started with him translating early Greek philosophical texts into Italian and other languages that people could actually read. And of course, Giotto is the main artist of the era, although Duccio would complain about that statement. Duccio was from the, let's just say Florence and Siena don't like each other. Giotto's from Florence, Duccio's from Siena. They constantly fight each other. Yes, these city-states like to fight each other. But Giotto gets the title of the first Renaissance painter, or Duccio. I actually really like Duccio. He was a pioneer in naturalism, and obviously you can see from this painting, very heavily influenced by Cimabue. This painting also draws heavily from Byzantine style. But really, his coming about and his art style does mark the end of the medieval style of Italy. This is an early Giotto piece. This is not his masterpiece. We're going to look at his masterpiece in a second. And it's the masterpiece that's really known for showing depth, strategic compositional choices, and more naturalism. This is something that he had to do for a church. So not as much artistic license was allowed or available. When these artists took commissions, as they were working off of commissions, it was unheard of at this time for an artist to make artwork just because of self-expression. That didn't happen. Making art for expressing your emotions doesn't come about until the late 1800s. So this artwork was made off of a commission, and that commission was a contract. The person paying for the artwork, the patron, would tell you what they wanted in the artwork and what materials they wanted you to use and the dimensions, and then you had to produce it by a set time. You could determine the composition that you wanted, but that's about it. And if you failed to meet their expectations as laid out in that contract, they didn't have to pay you. So artists pretty much always stuck to what was requested of them in these contracts, as they were legal documents. Therefore, that's why I said here with this painting, this was done for a church that demanded that he do specific things, such as including gold leaf, including a Mary and Christ on the throne, including saints and angels. Those were some of the requirements. Giotto's Arena Chapel, which is his masterpiece, was more free interpretation than this one was. It had requirements, but looser. So here you can really see pulled from Cimabue, as it's almost an identical composition style, besides he doesn't have the apostles down below. You still have a really large Mary. Mary does look more like a normal human versus some alien figure like Cimabue's. Christ is way too big. Mary's way too big. We know that. This is an example of hierarchic scale in late art. This was how they showed who the important person was, which was Mary and Christ. Around them are different angels and apostles. And if you look down here, they are sitting on a Byzantine style mosaic throne. So very heavily influenced by Byzantine, but he is trying to be more natural in his depiction of human forms. You'll notice we don't have that extremely repetitive pattern in the garments and folds. He's not using gold as a highlight here because gold does not look natural. So things are more realistic looking, and well, it'll get better. This is an early Giotto. His masterpiece is the Scrivini Chapel, also known as the Arena Chapel. It's called the Arena Chapel because it's right next door to an arena, but it's attached to the household or residence. It was a palace, the Scrivini Palace. It was paid for by Scrivini. He was a banker. He had a lot of sins that he was afraid of. You're going to see that in the video. So, yeah. Not going to elaborate too much on that. Some art historians believe that Giotto might have actually been the architect as well as the person who decorated the interior, because the frescoes on the inside fit the structure of the chapel so perfectly. If he was not, in fact, the architect, he obviously had very heavy influence on the overall building structure design.
We're in the Arena Chapel, a small private chapel that was connected to a palace that was owned by the Scrivani family.
And it was the Scrivani family who commissioned Giotto to decorate this chapel with frescoes.
It's called the Arena Chapel because it's next to an ancient Roman arena.
When you're inside it as we are now, I have to say that it's taller than I expected. And that feeling of being enclosed by...
Grace, can you see this? Because it's acting like it didn't share to you.
No, but I can
think so.
look it up.
No, I can share it. I'm like, it's
Oh, okay.
not looking like it's sharing, so. There we go, now it's sharing right.
by images that happens when you're in a space entirely covered with fresco.
There are lots of narrative scenes, but even in between those scenes are tromboy faux marble panels. And so we get the sense that there's inlaid stone, but in fact.
So that's stucco. We remember talking about that. It's not been that long.
This is all painting.
And that extends even onto the ceiling, where we have a star-studded blue sky with images of Christ and Mary and other saints and figures.
The Arena Chapel is organized in a very strict way. 3 registers begin at the top and move downward. I think of it as a kind of spiral. That is, it tells a continuous story. It begins with Christ's grandparents. It goes into the birth of Mary, her marriage, and then when we get down to the second register, we get to Christ's life or ministry. And then the bottom register is the Passion. These are the events at the end of Christ's life and immediately after his death.
Now, all of this is thanks to, strangely, it might seem to us today, a sin, the sin of usury that weighed heavily on the conscience of Enrico Scrivani, whose palace was next door and who owned this land and built this chapel and hired Giotto. His father was a usurer, Enrico himself was a usurer.
So what this means is He charged interest, just like when you borrow money from a bank, you're charged interest. When you put money on a credit card, you're charged interest. And so in a very Catholic environment, being a banker made you a lot of money, but it also, in your belief system, would send you to hell. And Dante, the great late medieval poet, in his most famous poem, The Divine Comedy, singles out Scrivini's father for one of the more treacherous parts of hell.
So Enrico was really worried.
Which, just a side note, one of the most popular literary texts for people to read in the 14th century was Dante's Inferno.
Mhm.
So everybody knew that Dante felt that the Scrivini family belonged to hell.
And for this reason, he did, in Catholic belief system, a good work. He built this chapel. This was his way of atoning for the sin of usury, hoping that this would help his soul to go to heaven. And we see Enrico himself here in this chapel on the wall over the entrance where Giotto painted the Last Judgment. We see Enrico kneeling, handing the chapel over to the Virgin Mary.
He's handing it to the three Marys, the Virgin Mary in the middle.
Notice where Enrico has put himself. He's on the side of the blessed. In the Last Judgment, we see Christ at the very top, and the damned are on Christ's left, and the blessed are on Christ's right, and that's where we find Enrico.
An impetus for the entire cycle can be seen at the apex of the triumphal arch on the opposite wall, with God, who calls Gabriel to his side, telling him to go to the Virgin Mary and announce to her that she will bear humanity's Savior, that she will bear Christ.
Interestingly, when Giotto painted God, he inserted a panel painting, so that is not fresco. It's interesting that he chose to paint it in a style that was more conservative, less earthly than the style that we see in the frescoes. But just to go back to that Annunciation and this wall, we begin to see the illusionism that we see throughout the cycles. If we look to Mary and the angel, Giotto has created an architectural space for each of them. These are not panel paintings with gold backgrounds that suggest a divine space. These are earthly settings for Mary and the angel.
There's another great example of the way that architecture and the sense of space is constructed, even in this era before linear perspective. Two scenes below the Annunciation are these wonderful empty architectural spaces, these rooms that have oil lanterns that hang from their ceilings. And there is such a delicate sense of space, of light and shadow. It is this bravura example of naturalism, and it shows Giotto's interest in the world.
And that interest in the world has to do with humanism, which is all about, you know,
The spiritual-
thinking for yourself and really observing life, what things actually look like. Which, side note, that hadn't been done in art since the classical era. People weren't actually studying models until Giotto. So we had that large break from Praxiteles, who wrote an entire canon about the human form, and the other classical artists that we talked about with Rome and Greece into Giotto. So a few hundred years, nobody was actually looking at people, which is why we got some pretty interesting looking people along the way. What do you guys think about Scrivini and his chapel before we move on?
I think it's pretty cool. They used the blue.
Yeah.
With the gold type of
Mhm.
start.
Yeah,
to
so we
kind
still
of
have like
reflect the spiritual-
Byzantine.
Yeah,
Yeah, but
Agreed.
very,
reflect the spiritual
Delicate.
realm versus
yeah.
the human realm.
Yeah, the spiritual is on the ceiling and it makes it look like heavenly. Obviously, this is going to play a big influence on something really famous later. Anyone have any guesses? I think you're talking about the same thing. She's talking about specifically the Last Judgment by Michelangelo. But I'm thinking a whole building.
There's
The Sistine Chapel, yes. So Michelangelo, for his Last Judgment, for the chapel as a whole, used the Scrivini Chapel as a reference, a launching off point. Of course, this is who's considered the first Renaissance artist, and Michelangelo's high Renaissance. So it does progress a lot from there, but we are not done.
I also appreciate the complexity, like,
Yeah,
in the composition of
Yes.
the entire chapel.
which is what we're going to focus on. Composition of everything was really well thought out. This is just one of the scenes. We're going to look at a couple from the Arena Chapel, because it wasn't just the overall chapel design that was extremely attention detailed. Every single panel was crazy, crazy well done and thought out for composition choices. So in total, there are 38 scenes that make up all of the frescoes in the Arena Chapel. That's not counting the faux marble panels. That's just counting the ones that have like stories in them. The ceiling, of course, is echoed in each scene with the background. The same blue that was used for the ceiling that Brandon really liked is the background of every single panel. So it makes it feel like it's cohesive, like the heavens have merged down into these landscapes, which just adds to the well thought out process of everything.
With the trail.
Yeah,
I think that blue is pretty.
it is a pretty blue, yeah. This is the same color blue, it's just dull from
Oh,
the picture that I could find that
okay.
clearly showed everything. This is the blue that I was working with, but it's the same exact shade of blue, I promise. But not only was the idea of ceiling carried down, he was also able to create very realistic three-dimensional looking forms with weight and mass, and support those forms with the composition choices that he made. So by composition choices in this particular panel called Lamentation, I'm talking about the tree and the rock. I know, that's like the least important thing in this image, but it supports the entire structure. Up here, this tree is a reference to the tree of knowledge from the Garden of Eden that, well, kicks sin off, and down here at the bottom, directly diagonal, is Christ who cleanses everyone of that original sin. So a nice little juxtaposition there. This rock leads your eye directly to the scene of Mary holding on to Christ, which is of course the main focal point. He's using directional forces, that's what that's called, to lead to the viewer's eye along the scene. And not only is he using the rock as a directional force, he's using everyone's eyesight to make sure that you know exactly where that main focal point is. Now, I do like to point out here, and I think I pointed it out later on as well, around this time, theater illustrating the Bible was really popular for people to go see. So a lot of Giotto's work and some of the other artists that we're going to look at is designed to look like it's a theater stage. So that is why we have such dramatic poses and over-the-top poses, because when people are acting, they're being overly dramatic to make sure they get their point across to the viewers. So you see that translate and be adopted over by these painters in their artworks. And this is just one early example of that popping up. Now, as mentioned, I had a couple scenes from the Arena Chapel. This one's my personal favorite. It's not really talked about in your book. There's an image of it, but they don't mention it. This is the portrayal of Jesus. So when Judas Iscariot kisses Jesus and notifies to the soldiers that that is the person they're wanting to capture. Is a very dramatic narrative scene. Very, very dramatic. And if you're wondering what that particular type of theater play is called, it's right here, Sacre Rappresentazione. No, I cannot speak Italian. But that is biblical narrative in theater form. No, it wasn't too hard.
No, pretty close.
For early Monday morning, I'm not mad about it. But these tools that Giotto started using of creating dynamic, interesting compositions using directional forces, creating depth of space, an illusion of space behind, as well as natural looking forms, is going to be adopted by later Renaissance artists and, well, advanced even further. And if you take survey 2, you're going to be starting straight off the bat with Renaissance art, which I need to talk about survey 2 at the end of the course because something happened. So you can. That takes us to Duccio. Duccio was Giotto's rival. Duccio was located in Siena. Siena was Florence's main rival as far as like making money from mercantilism. So yeah, in Siena, Duccio was the king of art. Yeah, yeah, I like his art. I think it's cool. He used a lot of gold, but I think it's really cool. In Siena, the Sienese government commissioned Duccio to create a huge altarpiece celebrating the Virgin Mary as they felt that she brought them victory against the Florentines in 1260 in one of the battles that they fought against them. When he finished making this piece called the Maestra, they had a parade. They literally carried this entire altarpiece from Duccio's studio to the cathedral, and it was a huge fanfare. There's a movie that someone made about it, and it like focuses on the parade. And I wish that I knew the name because my art history professor showed it to me, and it really captures the fanfare that this entire experience was about. It was a huge thing. Everyone came out to see it and celebrate Duccio's altarpiece. Really, he was king in Siena at that time. They even allowed him to inscribe on the altarpiece, "Holy Mother of God, be the cause of peace for Siena and of life for Duccio, because he painted you thus." Normally, that's not allowed. Normally, they would not allow you to like say, "Hey, bless me because I did this," on an altar for a cathedral, but they respected him. They respected his style, and he did have a little bit of creative control in making this, not a whole bunch, as they wanted a large amount of gold leaf used in this artwork to show off the ostentatious altarpiece that was meant for this cathedral. Once again, the last altar piece that we talked about, this one, gold. Catching a theme here. Really large altarpieces, very gold. I'll come back to this in a second. Done. Duccio, like Giotto, was very interested in the new naturalism, but he still held a great respect for the old style being Byzantine style. So we also see, once again, a lot of gold. He also incorporated some French Gothic motifs in the wood frame of the altarpiece. It is a double-sided altarpiece. You'll notice it when we look at it. You might want to pay attention for Duccio on his garments. Duccio was very interested in silk. Siena was one of the major trading spots of silk from China. It was along that trade route, and he would get pieces of the garment and see how it laid and draped on people to study what it looked like to have that expensive fabric flowing. And then he tried to capture that in his painting.
Does that he always painted Jesus in blue?
Yes. Which is one of the reasons why Jesus today is usually in blue. Mm-hmm. He also used punch work on his gold leaf. You kind of saw that in Giotto's Lamentation a second ago. Punch work is when you use literal like punches into the gold leaf as you're applying it to create a raised and lowered textural design. I should go back. You can see it right here in the saint's halos. That's usually where punch work is used, is on the halos. It's a textured design that you can actually feel in the gold. It creates like a shadow.
Yeah. The illusion of
It also makes it look more opulent. I don't know. Gold leaf is a tricky thing to work with. And I'm sure that you waste a lot of it when you're working on these things.
I've worked with bronze,
Yeah.
like hammered.
Yeah, gold leaf though, it's like tissue paper and you get like a glue-like substance and you apply it to it and you apply it with a paintbrush.
And then you let it sit.
Mhm. To get the punch work, you literally get like a designed piece of wood and you punch it in it to create that raised and lowered effect. So it's a little different. It's very decorative. And it does take a lot of skill and a lot of money to be able, because it's real gold. It's not like colored gold. It's real gold that they're using for all of these things, which is why they want to show these off in cathedrals. The more gold you can afford to use for crap, the better off you were. And if you remember, I mentioned that Siena and Florence like to compete with each other. This was one of the ways they competed, was with their altar pieces and their artworks in their cathedrals, like who could have the best stuff. So this altar piece was very celebrated for its time. Like I said, it is double-sided. It would have been in the center of the nave so that you could see both sides and walk around it. Some of the altar pieces, you can only see certain portions at certain times of the year. They would open different sections, like for Easter, for Christmas, whatever. You'll notice that more as you get into the Renaissance with Easterly too. But this one, the main portion is right here, Virgin Enthroned. If you remember Giotto and Cima Buies, it's quite a popular subject matter. Almost all early Renaissance and high Renaissance artists have painted it at some point. It's pretty much the same composition, throne, angels and saints surrounding. And I feel like the more interesting point is the frame itself is very much of the Gothic, French Gothic style, reminiscent to their architecture. And then, of course, on the lower panels, you have scenes of Christ's life, and on the back side, you have the Passion and Christ's works. Yeah, as I mentioned, some close-ups. Once again, very interested in silk and how fabrics actually lay on people. This is probably the most realistic depiction of fabric that we've seen so far. Is it the most realistic depiction of the Virgin and Christ? No.
No.
Giotto's is a lot more realistic, but this one is the most realistic depiction of fabric. He did one thing right then. Well, the others have all been huge too.
I know. It's like life.
Her face composition and modeling is more reminiscent of Cima Buies than Giotto's. She has that same soft, like boneless structure to her face that Cima Buies did. And of course, on all of these halos, do what?
It's kind of like Mona
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very much so. The halos all have that punchwork design, which you can't really see too much in pictures. It's kind of an in-person thing. I'm sure if you get a really, really big close-up, you could probably see it. But it reminds me of mosaic tile effect to it. Almost like Middle Eastern tile, as the patterns inside of it do reflect that. And that does take us to some of the students of Duccio. We're starting off with Martini, and then we'll look at a couple of other students, as he did take a lot of students, typical of the time though. The way that these artisans worked is they would all be under guilds, and the guild would designate you students, and the students would be around like 10 to 12 years old, and they study under you for several years. And then eventually they too would become members of the guild. And maybe eventually they'd be able to have their own studio. So Duccio, to create this, he had a lot of help. All of his students helped him on this. It wasn't just him. One of the students that did help him on that is Martini right here. Huh? Yeah. Yeah. it's 10 feet.
Okay.
Did you not pay attention to this one? This one is
Well,
7 by
I saw-
13.
Yeah,
They're all
Right.
really big. This one just doesn't have as much going on as the last
No.
one. Once again, very much Gothic motif as far as the frame. A lot of gold referencing Byzantine style. His posturing of these figures is also more Byzantine than classical. You have those extreme S curves that were pretty popular during that era. The boneless structures, the wings, yeah. The wings are done in punch work. So that one's really easy punch work that you can see. All of their halos are done in punch work as well. It's a little bit easier to see on this one. I do like the punch work. I think it's cool. Now, Martini himself actually only did this section. These side panels were done by his student, Lipo. Which you can kind of see the difference in style choices. So Martinis are much more curvilinear. Lipos are more reminiscent of like door jamb figures, very stiff, solid figures.
Which one
The style that Martini is known for working in is called the international style. That's not too important to know for you guys. It's just saying that he combined a lot of different styles together, which he did. We have Gothic, Byzantine, classical, all of it right here. Unlike Duccio or Giotto, he did not add any sort of scenery in the background, not really giving you any context to space. We didn't pull up these lower images, but they are landscapes like Giotto's landscapes. So we have a sense of space than any of Martini's works. It's a little different from his master in that respect, as well as creating very Byzantine-like structures. And he tried to do some linear perspective here with this chair, but it's not right. So you're understanding, I think, as we're going on, why Giotto is considered the master of this era. Probably. There are amazing artists from all over, but yeah, there's difference. Another one of Duccio's students, Pietro Lorenzetti. I'm not going to spend too much time on him because it's his brother that's more interesting. Lorenzetti brothers is where we are at. This is part of a large triptych, which is just a painting in 3 parts, usually an altarpiece in 3 parts. I do appreciate Lorenzetti trying to create the illusion of space here, using the frame itself to create like architectural features. Like this is actually the frame. It looks like a column, but it's the frame. The smart choices. Yeah.
Right, that window.
Yeah, the window in the background
Yeah.
alludes to the city behind it. This is Joseph awaiting for the news of the baby. So not a biblical scene, but he was looking at real life babies being born to come up with this composition. Not how it actually happened in the Bible. Once again, pulling off of those humanist ideas of studying reality and how things actually look and trying to portray it. A little bit better than this one. Although I appreciate this one too. For a different, yeah. Now, his brother Ambrosio is going to pull from Pietro's style, particularly that illusion of space and trying to create realistic architecture. And we see that carried into the Hall of Peace, which is located in the building Palazzo Pubblico in Siena. Another Sienese artist, by the way, both of these guys are. Well, all of them that we've talked about are, as they were all working under Duccio. This is Ambrosio Lorenzetti's masterpiece. It is The Effects of Good and Bad Government. We're only going to look at the good government portion because the bad government portion is extremely destroyed. There's not much left of it. It is kind of a political piece of art as it's trying to encourage the members of the society that the Sienese government is good. Yeah. Siena, as I kind of already hinted at, went to war a lot with the other city-states. It even fell to demise a few times because its own people rioted. So is it a peaceful land? No, not really. But they are trying to appear in this artwork, which is located in the civic building, so like their courtroom, that they are a peaceful commonwealth. So here is the city itself. He studied Siena's buildings and Siena's architecture to come up with this design. Once again, like I said, hinting at Pietro's exemplar use of trying to create depth and dimension using illusionary architecture. Here you can see it translated. This is illustrating a people group that is functioning as a society. Nothing is on fire, nobody is dying. Things are being built and sold and traded, and people are making money. Everything is good. And that carries over into the countryside. Up here we have the allegory of security presiding over the entire city-state of Siena. Yes, security. And this is kind of reminiscent of what Siena's countryside used to actually look like. A bit cartoonish depiction. I think this one's a bit cartoonish as well. But he is trying to pull off of what he's actually seeing in real life to create this work. Yeah, the angel, she's professing security and peace on Siena. If you look at the bottom, last line, in 1348, both the Lorenzetti brothers end up disappearing from records. Most people believe they died of the bombing. Like, yeah. Which was the fate of a lot of people, so. Sad. But both the Lorenzetti brothers studied under Duccio, as did Martini and, well, a lot of other people that we talked about. There's another one in the book that I just didn't mention. Let's take us into Florence, back to Giotto's hometown. We're going to take a little look at Florence Cathedral and be done for the day. Florence, very, very proud of itself, wanted to show that off in its architecture. They even considered themselves to be the daughter of Rome. They wanted to carry that over into the way their city was designed. This church was designed to hold the entire population of Florence at the time, which was 30,000. It does hold 30,000. That dome at the top was done later. The original dome was not like that. It fell.
Is it wood?
No, it wasn't wood. It's just they tried to create a more round dome and it collapsed in on itself. And it took a few tries before they got it right. That doesn't happen until the late Renaissance. This one's from a lot later. The Campanile was designed by Giotto, the king of Florence. The entire building, as well as the Campanile, is covered in marble. Directly across from the cathedral doors was the baptistry, just like Pisa and a couple of the other Italian churches that we talked about. The Campanile baptistry and cathedral are all separate buildings. And the doors on the baptistry are designed by Andrea Pisano, or other Pisa. Not related to the other two, but yeah. These doors were paid for by the Wool Guild. Wool. It's comprised of 28 bronze panels. They are separate. The last set of doors that we talked about, they were done in a single casting. This one, they are all separate panels. I told you we talked about more doors. I told you. This is the second set. There's another set yet, but we don't talk about them in this class. In fact, the same baptistry has two very famous sets of doors. This is just the early one. It does have a quatrefoil design, and all of the figure groupings have designs like stage settings that are very similar and owe a lot to Giotto's compositional stylings in the Scrovegni Chapel. And here's a close-up of Christ's Baptist baptism. So you see the landscape in the background, just like Giotto, and the figures in the foreground illustrating the scene. The backgrounds are never gilded in gold, the foregrounds are. Really kind of setting home the main focal point there. And that quatrefoil is what you see here. Another place I've been, but I'm not going to talk about it, Doge's Palace. Very pretty. Very pretty. I kept you over and I'm sorry, but I do want to talk about, tomorrow. Bring your books or your laptops. Now, here's the deal. Tomorrow, you guys don't have to come to class if you don't want to. If you need a quiet space to work, you can come here. I'm going to count you guys present regardless, but you need to be working on your individual presentations. Your individual presentation needs to be over either chapter 15, 16, or 17. Chapter 15 is South and Southeast Asia before 1200. Chapter 16 is China and Korea. And chapter 17 is Japan. Pick one of those, whichever one you find most interesting. Work with that. The specifics of your assignment, though, can be found under your presentation page. So I said you're going to select one chapter and 2 artworks from that chapter to focus on. So kind of what we've been doing thus far, just a little bit bigger. You're going to discuss the information that you feel represents that culture and choose the artifacts that you feel represent that culture. So let's say,
How many slides?
7 to 10. You will be making a slide presentation. I don't care what software you use, whichever one you feel most comfortable using. You should have 7 to 10 slides. Things that you should focus on, the culture itself. So usually, if you've noticed, I usually start off with a little snippet, like what's happening that is pertinent that you need to know to understand that artwork. Yeah. So history, religion, government, anything that'll help you understand that art piece. If it doesn't apply to that art piece, don't mention it. As I said, history, not only history itself, but historical significance of that art piece. How does it represent that culture? This is all based around like the artwork and how it represents the culture, in case you're not catching on. The artwork emulates the style of the culture. How does it represent them? Analyze the art piece itself. Discuss the important features of the piece. You do need to include a bibliography or a works cited page at the end, and label your images. Yeah. Your grading rubric is listed below, and it will be graded 20 points each, adding up to 100. Is your presentation cohesive? Did you do a good job of public speaking? The actual details of all this is in this paragraph above. You will be presenting your presentations next Monday in person. Yeah. Materials that you included in your presentation, are they thoughtful? Do they actually, are they pertinent? Are they important? Or is it just useful information? Like last period, I told my class, because we're doing presentations too, I had someone include the ticket prices to the Taj Mahal ones. That is not purchased. I don't need to know that. Is it relevant? Make sure the information is relevant. Assignment requirements are met. Your assignment requirements are up here. It's very broad, so they should be met. And of course, your bibliography. And this is due on the 24th, and you will be presenting on the 26th. Of course, if you do have questions, ask them. I am going to be in here every day, but once again, you do not have to come if you don't want to. It is up to you. I would encourage you to use outside sources beyond just your textbook. Highly encourage, actually. Like, it'd be really smart. Excuse me. You guys do a really good job of using outside sources. By the way, your papers were amazing. I graded them and gave feedback, but they were all really good. So thank you for that. Now, the last bit is something happened with Art Survey 2. I'm so sorry I'm keeping you late today. But something happened with Art Survey 2. It was supposed to be taught in the fall by Stan Jacobs, but he is not going to teach it now. The only offering of Art History Survey 2 is an online offering, unless you want to wait until spring, and then I'll be teaching Survey 2 in person. But yeah, no, sorry. It was not planned. This happened on Friday. So I apologize. The online version, it shouldn't be too bad. It'll be self-paced like an online class. So yeah, if you're wanting to take Survey 2, that would be what you can take immediately, or you can wait. But yeah, I'm going to stick around for a few more minutes if you have questions or just want to chat. But if not,